I couldn't help myself. We're going to be talking about Mary today. And before we begin with our guests, and we have two terrific guests, allow me the privilege of just telling you a very quick family story. So my father, for I'd say about 60 to 65 years of his life, was a very enthusiastic and knowledgeable heretic. And when he was on the brink of death, he was kind of going down the home stretch, and he was in a wheelchair at that point. And I would sometimes take him on little outings. So one day I took him to the Wadsworth Athenaeum, which is a wonderful art museum. And we were in a room. It's a Sunday afternoon, big crowds, lots of people all around. And, here's this nice middle-aged man pushing his father around in a wheelchair. And we're in a room that had a bunch of Madonna and Child kind of Renaissance paintings. And my father was sitting there very quietly and looking at them all. And then he suddenly kind of roused himself. And he said in this really loud voice, "What I don't understand is, if God wanted a son, why didn't he just make one? Why did that poor girl have to get knocked up?" At which point, all the people who had been looking at us with little smiles on their faces started backing away, and that was the end of that particular visit to the museum. But in a way, it is kind of the crux of the question, who is Mary? And a lot of that depends on who you think Jesus was. And we have some really interesting scholars on the show today to explore that with us, assuming that story did not scare them away. We're going to begin with James D. Tabor. He is a biblical scholar and retired professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He's the author of the book, The Lost Mary, Rediscovering the Mother of Jesus. We will add another guest in just another segment. But James Tabor, welcome to our show. And maybe we should begin with, just what might be aspects of Mary that people don't think about too much. I'm assuming that at one point you thought about titling this book, "What's a Nice Jewish Girl Like You Doing in a Place Like This?" Because one of the things that, maybe Christians don't even begin with is the idea that Mary would have been Jewish and probably would have been about, 15 at the time of the birth?
Yeah, good to see you, Colin. Thanks. That's a good way to start. I love your story. And I've got a kind of parallel story, not with my father, but it's in the first chapter of the book. When I'm in Jerusalem, the Notre Dame Center towers over the old city. And as you would expect, just as in South Bend, Indiana, where I started my teaching career, and I'm not Roman Catholic by background or conversion or anything else, is a statue of this Roman Catholic woman, right? Mary, the Mother of God, and her little baby. And you can see it from anywhere in ancient Jerusalem. It's kind of up on a hill, but outside the city. And when I'm with my students walking in that area, I always say, hold it. Students, look, there's a Jewish woman on top of the Catholic center, and she's holding that little Jewish baby. What is going on here? Of course, they all kind of, what? And then they look, and then they get it and smile and go, "Okay, Dr. Tabor. Yeah, she's Jewish, but..." So
Well,
it's
so
a very
I think
similar kind of story of sort of backing off and saying, what are we talking about here?
I think your book also reminds us that, in the telling, Mary is kind of there at Act 1, and then she comes back in around Act 5. She's there for the Nativity. She's there for the Pietà. Not a lot in between there. And in some ways, that's where some of the really interesting questions begin. For example, the notion that Jesus had siblings, possibly as many as 7 siblings. Can you tell us a little bit about this and what the sources are for that idea?
Sure. Well, they're actually in the New Testament, but then, of course, it depends on how somebody interprets them. But the one I would go to first is just the very first chapter of the New Testament, Matthew 1, which gives this long genealogy of Joseph, the husband of Mary. And it tells about how she turns up pregnant and he's not the father, and says the child's of the Holy Spirit. But at the end, when Jesus is born, it simply says he knew her not until she had brought forth her firstborn son. And any common reading of that, it's biblical language, to know a woman, like, hey, Adam knew his wife and she brought forth, Cain and Abel and Seth. And so It's just the term in Hebrew, and this is written in Greek, so it's adapting that Hebrew. To know a woman is to sleep with her, to be open yourself to pregnancy, and so forth. So the implication, even in the first chapter, is Joseph's not the father, but there were presumably other kids. And then if you go to Mark, which we think is our earliest gospel, so we got first chapter of the New Testament, Matthew, and maybe an earlier text, Mark chapter 6, is this not Jesus, son of Mary? Are not his brothers here, James, Joseph, Simon, Jude, and his sisters? And it's given so matter-of-factly. And several times in the New Testament Gospels, it says, and Jesus took his mother and brothers and did this or that. And suddenly, Joseph, by age 12, when Jesus is 12, is gone, never mentioned again. And I think it's kind of inconceivable that he would just never show up. And yet you have Jesus taking his mother. And so she now, I think we should say, as a widowed mother. And there's time for those kids, whether they were 7, 8, 9, 10. But if you just think in terms of the minimum, you've got 5 boys named and then sisters, which is at least 2. So I just say 7 just because that's the lowest count. But it could be more. I don't know about your past and ancestry, but judging by your last name, maybe some Catholic background. But if you think about my grandmother had 10 kids, and she was only in her 40s or 50s when all 10 were born. So it definitely can work out if usually these kids are about 18 months apart just by natural means, nursing a child and so forth. So the problem is not those texts. They're pretty clear to, I think, most readers. It's theology. And that is, it's this idea within our culture that, well, holiness and sexuality can be compatible, but they don't really mix at the highest level. Like I don't want to compare it in a trivial way, but like, did your parents really have sex? Well, yeah, your family's here, but it's not, just let's not talk about that or something of that sort. But
right.
It's worse than that.
So some of the early theologians, they don't want to see it that way. There are those brothers, but it's just inconvenient. So pretty in the early stages of Christian theology, there's this idea, they're cousins, or they're some kind of half siblings or something. I mean, the theologians start dividing up around this question.
Yeah,
and then go ahead.
A little later than I would say it's 3rd and 4th century, so it takes a while.
Mm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then, so there another thing that kind of comes into your work is a lot of the work that you do is relies at least somewhat on non-canonical gospels. And these range from one that's found in 1945 to the Gnostics. There are a lot of non-canonical gospels that deal with some of this stuff very, very differently. And so say a little bit about that. I mean, I think it's perfectly fair to do that since the church also relies on apocryphal gospels for some of the stuff that we'll be talking about later. But talk about how many different pictures there are of this once you get outside those 4 gospel books and then the letters that follow.
There are other sources outside the New Testament. They do help, but they're almost tidbits along the way. Like I do open the book, first chapter or 2, about the city of Sepphoris, which is the urban capital of the Galilee, and it's only 4 miles from Nazareth that everybody's heard of, and nobody's heard of the capital city. So I always tell people it's like Tuckahoe, New York, which is 4 miles north of the Bronx. I've actually known people that know that. And I say, imagine someone from there and became famous, and later you have a biography of them, and New York City is never mentioned. That's where we are with the New Testament, because it's very theological. So we get things like the Proto-Evangelium of James. It's a mouthful, but it's a 2nd century text. You've got to separate the really crazy legendary stuff for some of the factual things that might bear up historically and get some kind of collaboration from other texts. Like, for example, in some of those texts, Jesus is made fun of and bumps into a kid on the street, so he just like strikes him dead.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I wouldn't give that much credence. Or he jumps off a roof to show he can fly.
Mm-hmm.
So those kind of things grow up around all figures.
But
But
there
then,
are some very specific things that are important to your argument.
absolutely,
One of
yeah.
them is that it is possible. I don't know how much beyond possible we want to say it is that John the Baptist, or John the Baptizer, as you call him, might have been Mary's nephew, and also possible and argued in the book that one of Jesus's brothers, James, takes over and kind of perpetuates the movement, takes over once Jesus is dead, and grabs the reins. So say a little bit about those two things.
So the sourcing on those is really good, and it's actually in the New Testament as well as outside, and that really helps when you sort of have that double track. So let's start with John the Baptizer, or Baptist. I just don't want people to think he's a member of the Baptist church here. But John the Dipper, it means to dip in water and to be baptized. In Judaism, it's called the mikvah, but it's to join the community, very much like the Dead Sea Scrolls. So Luke, one of our best sources for Mary, does say that when Elizabeth was pregnant with John, 6 months pregnant, that Mary fled to the little town Ein Kerem, where Elizabeth and her husband lived, and stayed 3 months. So here's a new scene that I've never seen in a movie, that Mary attends at the birth of John. So not only are they related, we don't know if it's aunt or something of that nature, but it's a word that means a close relative. When we would say that, I'm related to that person closely. And you could see the intimacy of the birth of these kids. And then Mary goes back to Nazareth after that. So that one's really important. As far as James, we've got all kinds of sources on James. It's just that they got forgotten because of Peter becoming known as the Pope and the head of the church. But again, some of them are in the New Testament. When Paul goes to Jerusalem, and this is well documented in his letter called Galatians, he said, I saw Peter, okay, and I saw James, the Lord's brother. And it's very clear as he goes on to talk that James is in charge. He talks about the pillars of the church. And guess what? Here's the order: James, Peter, and John. It's hierarchical. So if you take that and then look at these other sources, for example, Nag Hammadi, you mentioned, 1945, Gospel of Thomas. What an amazing saying occurs there. The disciples go, you're going to leave us. What are we going to do? And he says, no matter where you go, look to James the Just. And that's his brother. So that's actually in that particular gospel. It's then backed up with other parallels, even in the New Testament. The biggest decision the church had to make was what to do with Gentiles, non-Jews. Can they just come in? It's a Jewish movement. And the decision was, yes, they can come in based on their faith in Jesus. They don't have to convert to the religion of Judaism. And it's James who stands up in the book of Acts, chapter 15, like he hits a gavel and says, my decision is, and at that point in the book, you wonder, who? Who is this now in charge saying his decision? But when you read it the other way, you suddenly realize, well, because he was appointed by Jesus in these sources to be the main person. Today, people, my students, everybody would say, James who?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
You've got two Jameses in the 12, and he's not one of if he's not one of those, well, where's this other James coming from?
And I think a lot of what we're talking about here, too, I've always said that there are very few truly monotheistic major world religions, and Christianity is certainly not one of them. I mean, you start with the Trinity, you've got angels, you've got saints, and as you point out, you have Mary and maybe some of her other offspring, too, but especially Mary as this kind of liminal figure who can connect the human to the immortal, can connect the human to the divine. And I think, you know, in your book, I see that as the role that she grows into. She's not quite as divine as Christ. On the other hand, she's doing a pretty good job in second place there. But say a little bit more about how you see that.
Well, in the early days, I think it was more the respect you would give a mother of the charismatic leader, the messianic leader of the movement. And when Jesus dies, his brother takes over the leadership of the movement. So she must have, and she lived in Jerusalem for all those years. I trace all of that. I do some of the archaeology of that. And so I picture her again. We don't have sources. Last time she's mentioned is Acts chapter 1, which is the birthday of the movement after Jesus' death. And it says Mary, his mother, and Jane and the brothers were there. But what do you mean were there? Were they just hanging out on a corner or what? Well, they're there all right. And I think over the years, as Paul went up to Jerusalem and others, and as people came in, I try to capture in the book a kind of not mother of God, that's later theology, but almost godmother that people would want to come and meet and revere the woman who's still living, who ends up losing two of her sons eventually to violent deaths. Jesus by crucifixion, James the brother was stoned to death and beaten to death right in Jerusalem about 7 years before the Roman destruction. Whether Mary lives to see that, I almost hope not. But she well might have if you just think about the age, if she was in her 70s.
But, you know, I think another part of the picture that emerges, and it's very much there at the end of your book, is this can be looked at as, pardon the expression, a one-man show, or it can be looked at as a movement that had a lot of interesting moving parts and other people in it, and maybe kind of a family business, if you'll pardon that expression. But maybe say a little bit about that. There's a way of thinking about all this, with Jesus having siblings, with Mary having the role that she played, with John the Baptist being maybe a nephew, that this isn't so much a one-man show.
Precisely. And just as soon as you add the brothers in the household and you begin to imagine a Jewish household outside the major city of the Galilee where the king Herod Antipas lived, he's not technically a king, but we call him a king, a ruler. He's the son of Herod the Great. It's called a tektart, technically one of the four rulers. Uh, and you begin to see that how are they making a living? We say, well, Jesus is a carpenter, but the word there is tekton, architect. It means a builder, really. It's a generic term. And he's the son of a carpenter. Now that begins to give the idea of apprenticeship. So what I'm doing, I'm taking these little tidbits and trying to expand them within their cultural context, their geographical context, their archaeological context. And you can very easily see Sepphoris was destroyed in the year 4 BC when Herod the Great died because of a revolt. And there were thousands of crucifixions. I have a chapter on that. And so instead of a calm, silent night, you've got Mary nursing her 1-year-old baby in Nazareth, right outside of Sepphoris, flames going up. But then the city gets rebuilt over the next 10 years, beautifully excavated there and gotten down to these beautiful mosaic floors. I think I have a picture in the book of some of that. And so where's work? You go where work is. And so Jesus, he doesn't talk about carpentry. What do you do as a carpenter in the ancient world? Make a door frame, a wagon, or something like that. That's about it. Maybe a window. They didn't even put wooden windowsills necessarily in their houses. But he talks about stones all the time. You know, if you're digging a foundation, you need to go very, very deep and be careful. This sounds like a builder to me. So I think he's a builder. And 4 a.m., the alarm rings and everybody's getting up, and I want a busy household. It's never being shown in the movies. It's an entourage, really. And then other people come in and join, and it becomes a kind of roving evangelistic movement, really, going all over. But the women and children are important too, and the dogs. And, you know, you want to picture not just the movies have Jesus, the lone one, and then the 12 walking up a hill, down a hill, sitting on a rock. I don't think it was like that. I think for the first 30 years, he's going to work every morning, coming home tired, and thinking about what his role would be as he reaches age 30, which marks you as a kind of adult in that culture.
All right, we're going to take a little pause here. We're talking to James Tabor. We're going to come back. We're going to add a guest, and we're going to go some new places.
Will the wind ever remember the names it has blown in the past? And with this crutch, its old age and its wisdom, it whispers, no, this will be the last. And the wind cries, Mary.
Mary had a baby born in Bethlehem, and every time that baby would cry, she rock him in the weary land. Mary rocked that baby all night, rock that baby all night, rock that baby all night. I say all night long. Mary had a baby born in Bethlehem. Every time that baby would cry, she rock him in the weary land. Mary rock that baby all night. Rock that baby all night.
All right, we are back. We are going to continue our conversation about Mary. We still have with us James D. Tabor, biblical scholar and retired professor of religious studies at University of North Carolina in Charlotte. He's the author of The Lost Mary, Rediscovering the Mother of Jesus. Joining us now is the Reverend Dr. Amey Victoria Adkins-Jones, assistant professor of theology and Africana studies at Emory University. She's a constructive theologian and scholar of Black religion, specializing in Mariology, Black feminist and womanist thought, and theological anthropology. She's the author of Immaculate Misconceptions, a Black Mariology. So, first of all, welcome to our conversation, Amey Victoria. And I should tell you that when the first time we had a meeting about this, and Robyn Doyoon-Aitken said she wanted to produce a show about Mary, I think maybe the first thing I said was, well, we got to talk about the Black Madonna, because I'd been in Rocamadour in France for a completely different reason, and suddenly there's all this stuff about the Black Madonna. I said, I got to go see what this is. And I don't think I realized at the time that this was just a small piece of a much larger whole. So can we kind of start there and talk about this idea of Black Madonnas? They exist both in Europe and in the New World, and I'm not sure where else.
Yeah, of course. Well, Colin, thank you so much for having me. And thank you for these excellent music choices. I am really impressed and a fan. So Black Madonnas are incredible and really wide-ranging. They are the statues, the icons, the paintings of the Virgin Mary, sometimes with Jesus, sometimes without, that have dark or even, completely Black skin. And so they exist all around the world, right? And in places that make a lot of sense. In Ethiopia, the Orthodox Church, every Madonna is a Black Madonna. There are all of these traditions. But it's interesting, the Black Madonnas that most folks associate with and that are recognized by the church, many of them exist in Europe. And part of their lore is around the question of being Black, and what that means and what that doesn't translate into meaning. And so there are wonderful ones all around the European continent. There are many in the Americas as well. And folks have found, healing, miraculous, intervention on behalf of, Christ, the Godhead, the Virgin Mary, in and around these sites. So they attract millions of pilgrims all around the world and are deeply embedded in many folks' life and devotion to God.
Yeah, and one thing you sort of alluded to, but I want you to say a little bit more. These are kind of working Madonnas. They're not just sitting around being admired. They're doing things having to do with helping people with specific problems or with liberation issues and maybe resisting colonialism. Say a little bit more about the work they do.
Yeah, so while they are beautiful, they are, they're not trophy Madonnas, if you will. They are sites and are representative of the Virgin Mary as one who is bringing the prayers of the people before God. They really represent the idea of Mary as intercessor and Mary as one who not only shares the kind of compassion, right? Like today is Ash Wednesday, so we're thinking toward the passion of Christ. Mary is seen as the one who brings compassion, shares in the sufferings of her son, but she also is one who cares and is one as exemplar of the human race, is one who wants to communicate, wants to comfort, wants to hold vigil with all of those in humanity who are living their lives and facing, some of the difficult reality of life. So she cries, she sometimes bleeds, she sometimes, laughs and has these different apparitions and all of these different traditions around Madonnas and around Black Madonnas as this kind of sort of holy sector of these icons. But she is one who responds, and that means a lot to a lot of people.
I want to come back to crying and bleeding in just a second. But I want to bring James Tabor back in and have both of you talk about this. And I had to kind of reverse engineer this today as I was trying to understand it. But one thing that became clear to me is that in the last couple of years, and it really probably starts more like 30 years ago because things in the Vatican move pretty slow, there's been sort of a crackdown on Mary. And so we get a document by one of the major Vatican committees released sort of 2024 into 2025, Mater Populi Fidelis, which basically it's a 20-page document which says that means the mother of the faithful people of God. And they seem to be worried that she's getting too big. For her own britches, I guess, and that she is being called co-redemptrix and mediatrix of all graces. And the Vatican rejects those things and says whatever she does, her intercessions are properly seen as taking place through the agency of Jesus Christ. And they also, right around the same time, changed the rules for the validation of Marian apparitions. So one of the things that Mary does, if you think about it, is she appears in places, so and much more often than Jesus does. Once again, there's that liminal quality of she's somebody who might appear to you in Lourdes or Guadalupe or wherever. And they changed the rules about that. And they say it's no longer up to the bishops. No, there is no Marian apparition that we can sign off on unless the Pope personally signs off on it. And so I'm going to have you start, James Tabor. What am I seeing here? What's going on? Why would they suddenly be the cops on the block about Mary and Mary getting too big?
Well, it's been spearheaded by our new Pope, or the new Pope. I'm not Catholic, but are collectively the Pope of the Western Church. And I think it's the idea that you don't want to mix the roles. Jesus has to always be the Redeemer, the one who paid for sins. Mary has to be beyond all the other saints by far. And so there is that liminal position, as you say. But I remember growing up, even though I wasn't Catholic, plenty of Catholic friends. And the idea seemed to be, this is just on the street. And I'd love to hear what Amey picked up as well growing up, that, well, if you go to Mary, though, she's a woman. She raised Jesus from diapers. She's definitely got an in with her own son. And maybe that would be what we might say in Israel, it's a local call. So to Mary, you're going right to Mary with your request, and she's also a mediator of these revelations and so forth. For my study, all of that is later, and I don't expand much on it, and I'm sure Amey has better understanding of that. But I went to the University of Chicago, and the Pope actually was in a few of the classes that I took because of that yeah. Chicago consortium. So we're both old enough. And I wish I remembered him. I'm sure he doesn't remember me. But I think of him trying to, he's very intellectual and very scholarly, and clearly reads. I'm sure he'll read both of these books. He's that type, and he wants to be sure that everyone is clear on who's the Redeemer, who dies for the sins of the world. That has to be the one who came forth from God and is actually part of the Trinity. And Mary's not that, but to to have devotion and so forth, it has a whole range of possibilities.
Yeah, Amey Victoria, some of my readings suggested that, on the internet, everybody's a virologist or an expert in political science. And maybe on the internet, on social media, everybody's a Mariologist too. And I'm kind of wondering whether the guys at the Vatican are thinking, yeah, no, they're just making up stuff that we're not signing off on. But tell me a little bit more about what you see and hear in this, very, very contemporary resistance to an expansion of thinking about Mary.
Well, I can affirm that there are a lot of social media profiles of professed theologians. So maybe Mariologist is becoming one of those as well. The thing about Marian devotion is that, particularly with the Vatican, because there are multiple churches and multiple bodies that affirm certain apparitions or affirm certain things that the Vatican does or does not. But the thing about Marian devotion is that it has often the people have pushed the official dogma. Many of the dogmatics around Mary have happened much later than the early church centuries. And that is because there's a need and a want, a desire to clarify what is happening in these incredibly mysterious spaces, right? So if people are saying that they were sick and they're healed, right? All of these things that are pointing to a mystery of who God is, but also these things that are supernatural, it's really difficult just off top to say whether something can be proven or not. And that's always been the question, right? Like the Vatican doesn't prove apparitions. They deem what is worthy of belief, right? Like what doesn't go against, what's stated as doctrine, what's not going to get us into any theological errors or any sort of dangerous territory. That being said, Mary has sort of had a bit of a resurgence in her popularity, particularly in pop culture and media. A lot of artists, of course, everybody knows Madonna, but, since then, a lot of different artists playing around with not just Marian imagery, but a lot of goddess imagery as well. And in the United States, folks see Mary on, the water of a window pane, right? Like there's a lot of seeing Mary in all sorts of places and all sorts of claims. So I'm not surprised by wanting to have a little bit more in this era of artificial intelligence, of social media, of not knowing quite what you see. I think that there's a bit of a technological response in terms of wanting to have some stricter standards around what counts or what is deemed to be real. But I also think that it's important to note that even in this latest, doctrinal note, there's a lot of Mariologists who had pushback. And the term of co-redemptrix, or how we understand what Mary might be doing or could be doing, and how to keep that separate from how we understand Jesus's salvation, that has been murky, swampy area for a number of centuries with a number of different folks. So I'm not surprised to see it, but I'm also not surprised to see, several groups of theologians say, hey, like we don't actually agree with this note and some of the theological claims because, these are pushing more toward a popular understanding as opposed to maybe a deeper, mysterious theological understanding.
So while we're talking about swamps and blood and tears, James, I think there's kind of a sense in the male-centered hierarchy of the church that women are messy. They have blood, they have tears, they have breast milk, they menstruate, they have hormones, they have discharge, they have amniotic fluid, they have estrogen, and the boys, they're not very comfortable with all that stuff, and particularly the implication of all that stuff for Jesus. So once again, in the somewhat early stages, you start to see a movement for making her less corporeal, having less of a body, therefore being less messy. And back to that whole idea of non-canonical sources. You mentioned the proto-evangelium of James. That's kind of the place they have to go to get a Mary who herself is conceived without original sin, who is without sin at the time of conceiving Jesus, at the time of Jesus' birth, and maybe even, well, definitely to them, even after all that, for the rest of her life and into her death, she is going to be without sin. But maybe you could say a little bit more about why were such extreme measures necessary?
Sure. I think I always quote the Apostles' Creed. People will remember some of this. It's our earliest Christian creed. And it talks about the one God, the Father, and the one Lord Jesus. And then it says, born of a virgin, crucified, died, and buried, raised the third day. Now that's Jesus, but notice the polarity there. As you mentioned in the beginning, born and died. What's in between there? The life of a human person in the case of Jesus. But then with Mary, she's okay with that role with some people. What did she do? Two main things. She brought Jesus into the world, and she was faithful to the end as he died, because it's the women at the cross, along with this mysterious unnamed person, the beloved disciple. So you can see what's going on here. You're interested in how Jesus got here through her and how he exited. And then, as Amey said, much, much later, really, the full development of how Mary exited. Because in the early church, she's buried, she dies. The Dormition Abbey that I talk about and the space that it's built over was where she lived and died, we think. But then, okay, she died, but what happened? Did she just rot in the grave like we all do when we die, or, dust and ashes? That would be the normal thing to think. But with Mary, wait a minute, she's got to be more than that. And so you do have this idea of her assumption. Now, it's talked about very early on, but it doesn't become official dogma. You can see the caution here. Like, do we really want to go that far? That she also ascended bodily into heaven. And that goes back to the 19th century.
So yeah, let's get a little bit more into this, Amey Victoria. Is it a stretch to say that some of this is almost a fear of women, a fear of the way women really are, that Mary has to be made into this kind of sanitized version of a woman, that you unwrap from some sterile packaging or something? What's going on here? I mean, it's a lot of the things that James just said, but what else do you see there?
I think there's a lot of things, in the early church and moving from the Apostles' Creed to, Nicaea and all of these other creeds, and Chalcedon, the church is trying to figure out who is Jesus and how do we explain this very kooky idea that there is someone who is fully God and fully human. And in the early church, many of the patristic fathers, the early folks writing were really insisting, and even, folks like Tertullian get pretty graphic in terms of describing Mary's birth. And, there's got to be all of the fluids, even though here I have to say men have lots of fluids too.
We do.
But there's got to be all of the fluids, all of the grossness, right? Like all of the ways that these things are seen as defiling, right? Like in Jewish culture and where many of these folks are coming from. But there's got to be a real birth to demonstrate that Jesus is human. There's a lot of folks saying that he just appeared to be human. There's a lot of folks saying that the flesh is bad and that, we're all trying to escape. There's all of these things that folks are trying to work around and make sure we make sense of. As we move further along, Mary starts getting pregnant in the ear. Mary starts getting pregnant, from a beam of light. Birth starts happening where Jesus neatly and cleanly appears on her lap. We get further and further away from some of the question of Mary in relationship, or Mary sort of verifying Jesus's full humanity and full divinity. into some of these questions that do get applied to women's bodies. I don't think that there's inherently a fear of women's bodies or of women, but we do see the use of Mary's iconography, right? It's impossible for any human woman identified person to, as far as I know, maybe there's some scientific intervention, but to be mother and virgin in the ways that historically it was meant at the same time. And so as we enter things like colonialism, right, Mary becomes a hugely disciplining force as we start to see development of questions around race, as Christianity becomes heart and soul of colonial enterprise. Mary becomes a figure who is less and less human. We think of being dehumanized as somehow being degraded. Well, Mary's being dehumanized is really her being more and more divinized in a way that women in particular are being told to emulate, but also can never actually emulate well. And so that does become a question when there are so many women who are members and comprise, so many of the populations of various churches, including the Catholic Church, and don't necessarily have access to leadership structures in the same kind of way. Mary is someone who ends up being really powerful for a lot of folks. Even the concept of virginity, yielding power in different points in times for folks. But she also is someone who ends up being, really, really, really on the side of power and the oppressor historically, which we have to ask some questions about how we get from her Magnificat and her descriptions of who God is and who God is for, to the ways that, her image is used to qualify a lot of violence in the world.
All right, we're going to have to pause there. This hour is just flying by here with these two terrific guests. We'll grab a quick break. We'll come back. We'll say some more about depictions of Mary. Time for a few quick thank yous, starting with the maestro, Dylan Reyes, our technical producer. This particular episode was produced by my boss, Robyn Doyoon-Aitken. So I've been really careful not to mess it up, because otherwise she might want to make some changes. But I think it's going well, and it's been really fun working with Robyn this way. This was all her idea and her execution, and it's been really, really fascinating. And will continue to be for the final segment. We're going to talk some more about the way that that Mary is depicted. I'm going to do that with James Tabor. His book is The Lost Mary, Rediscovering the Mother of Jesus, and the Reverend Dr. Amey Victoria Adkins-Jones. Her book is Immaculate Misconceptions, A Black Mariology. So first of all, Maestro, get the Aretha clip ready here, because I want to talk about depictions, particularly sort of visual depictions. But Amey Victoria, I thought about this song when I started working on the show, and then I thought, no, it's going to be kind of cringe, particularly if I play the Beatles version of it. But the more I looked at your work, I thought, maybe Lennon and McCartney were kind of seeing around the corner here a little bit here, because it really does connect pretty well from what they were to what you're talking about to what they were singing in 1968. But let's hear Aretha do a little bit of this song.
Lady Madonna, children at your feet. Wonder how you ever managed to make ends meet. Find money when you pay rent. Did you think the money was heaven sent?
Well, you know the rest of the song. But so Amey Victoria, McCartney said that he started out writing about Mary, and then somehow or other, I think John Lennon got involved with the lyric. It really became about a working class woman, maybe a single mother who is struggling to make ends meet. And I think that transition is kind of interesting based on what we're talking about right now. And how do you reclaim and repurpose Mary so that she is relevant to the circumstances of people today who are not in power?
Yeah, so I love this song, and I love Aretha. And I love asking questions about where we might see Mary today. We're really good, and this comes probably from Matthew 25, this scene of Jesus, telling the disciples, they missed him, right? Because he was hungry. They didn't feed him. And, they went, Lord, when did we see you? Well, I was thirsty. You didn't give me anything to drink. You didn't visit me, when I was in prison. And so really sort of pointing to those who are on the lower end, or on the least of these, sort of, to use, theological terms, of society. And so what we don't do well is think about, well, who would Mary actually have been, and who would Mary be today? And Mary, she is named and sort of imagined alongside, those in power as queen, and as, sort of being all powerful, and in these various sorts of, collusions with hierarchy. But scripture and even, these non-canonical stories really speak to that she is kind of a regular girl. And she's not coming from all of the wonderful circumstances. The later gospels imagine her as, her Anna and Joachim might have been, wealthy or things like that. But her humility and her sort of care of others is pretty consistent in the tradition. And so you have to ask, well, wait, where are women, giving birth in conditions of duress? Where do we see inequities in terms of how we have access? When we pull out the nativity scenes every Christmas, are those just nostalgic for us? Or are we actually asking questions about folks living in and with and among us in society? And in my work, I think about the Black Madonna, one, because there are all of these sorts of sacred explanations of her that make me ask a question: how can these images of Black women really be so sacred, and that not translate to actual Black women you might actually encounter? But also to ask some different kinds of questions of how we understand resourcing one another, how we understand community, and how we understand equity in a world that continues to find our resources on very different planes.
James Tabor, we're almost out of time, but you got about 45 seconds to say how you want to see Mary understood right now in this moment.
Thanks. I want to give her back all of these things: the Jewish mother, single mother, 7 or more children, widowed, and the extraordinary time she lived in, the dangers that she faced, that her children faced. I've got this chapter called 2000 Crucifixions. She witnessed that and lived through it, holding one of her babes, Jesus, in her arms. So I want to put her back there, and I think there we can find new inspiration for Mary. Not the Queen of Heaven necessarily, not the Mother of God necessarily. Those are theological things. But put her back in her time. I try to do that. And also as the teacher, capital T.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop you now. I'm really, really sorry.
So
we are
that's
flat out of
teacher.
time. James Tabor and Amey Victoria Adkins-Jones, thank you so much. Thanks for listening to